With that, why don't we turn Suzanne to some of your thoughts on the subject. So Patricia has a lot of the political kind of thing going on. Suzanne has a lot of the activist on the ground picture of the story.
So many things come to mind after hearing these pieces that have been presented so well by everyone. One thing that I need to say is about the way that repatriation has been interpreted, and I think misinterpreted, by a number of judges in the country. One in the Kennewick Man case about whether or not NAGPRA applies to the Ancient One and whether the Native nation should have, who claimed him in the Northwest, should be allowed to rebury him. And one judge found that NAGPRA didn't even apply. And why? Because the definition of Native American was written in such a way that NAGPRA only applied to anyone who was buried or who post-dated 1776, the founding of the country. So that was very strange, and that for that circuit still holds, even though the tribes were not a party to that case, and even though their views hadn't been heard, and there hadn't been any real discussion of that, an argument of that point. And no one in their right minds who put the act together thought that NAGPRA only applied to people who were buried after America was founded, after the United States was founded. So that's a silly thing that the courts have done, but in an elaborate way of making one dead Native person be subject to the very laws that made us the archaeological resources of the United States of America that we were trying to get away from in the human rights legislation of NAGPRA. The other is the recent decision by the Circuit Court in the case of who gets to bury Jim Thorpe, the town of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, where he is now, or the Sac and Fox Nation, where he wanted to be buried in Sac and Fox territory, in Sac and Fox ways, and his family, who are the next of kin and the lineal descendants of Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe had been taken in the middle of his death ceremony, his name, the return of his name, his Indian name ceremony, which had been taken by people who came in a door reserved only for the dead, and took him in the middle of that ceremony out, and he was sold. His remains were sold to what became the town of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. So the judges are saying that this NAGPRA does not apply to a town. Well, yes, it does. We didn't mean just museums or just federal agencies or just educational institutions. We meant any holding repository. We didn't name in NAGPRA historical societies, but they're included They're definitely a part of this. And there's a list of entities that were not named in NAGPRA but are covered by NAGPRA and the rules of it because they are holding repositories of human remains or other things. So I hope that is changed in the future, that particular ruling, but these are kinds of things that are so important now, and you see a lot of backsliding in museums where people, even though we took great pains not to define the sacred when we were working on the legislation, because no other religions have to define the sacred. So why should we? Why should we have that additional burden on us? And we won that argument. But I see a lot of backsliding by various museums, including the National Museum of the American Indian, where there are efforts to prove that something is sacred. Well, it's a declarative process. It's sacred because the people it's sacred to have said, this is sacred. And there's no other test. It's not up to a museum administrator or any kind of bureaucrat in any holding repository. It's up to the people whose religion it is. So that's the kind of thing that I think we have to be very guarded about and very careful about, because we're going to lose 25 years of effort and 25 before that of serious effort to gain repatriation legislation. And make no mistake, I mean, we revolutionized museology in several ways just by requiring inventories. Holding repositories didn't know what they had in their museums or in their collections. They had no idea. And I'll speak for the one I was trustee of, the Museum of the American Indian in New York, whose collection formed the basis of this museum once nationalized. The meeting that Patricia talked about, where we all went to New York and went through the collection, there had been a flood the night before in this warehouse in the Bronx, and the inventory cards for what inventory existed were on recipe cards, and some of them were handwritten, and so the ink was running. Some were typed, so you could still read them, but they were all curled up like giant Fritos. And they were people had them all on the tops of anything that was dry, so file cabinets, ledges. So there were all of these little recipe cards curled up and waiting to be dried out so they could be flattened out. And the fringe of the buckskin dresses was just filled with sewer water. There were wharf rats in there, and I don't know if you've ever seen a wharf rat, but they're giant. I mean, these are like small dogs. I mean, they're they're not tiny things. They're big gray rats, and there were big water beetles. So this was the condition granted under extraordinary conditions, a flood. Nonetheless, this was how the collection was being housed. We had already been, before that meeting, we had already been through a number of meetings as trustees of the Museum of the American Indian, trying to find a home for this collection because it was deteriorating rapidly, and we needed to have some place for it to stabilize and then to refurbish, to begin to make repairs. And every place we talked with had some, they all wanted the collection. The American Museum of Natural History, the Corning glass, Steuben glass, all wanted this collection. And they didn't want to give anything to us, though. They didn't want a specific number of Native people on the Board of Trustees. They didn't even want the Museum of the American Indian to have a presence on the new entity that would be created. And what we were really looking for was a national place. We wanted the cultural center that we had envisioned in 1967 when we first met about this and envisioned what a place that worked for us might be, because no place was working for us. And we always called it a cultural center until right before we started working on the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 1978, and we really had to change to museum because cultural center didn't fit in any place. So we changed our thinking about that to museum, but we were trying to put as many elements of a cultural center as we could into that. And we worked very closely at that time with the people who had been the bookends of the sponsors for the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and those were Senator Barry Goldwater and Senator Ted Kennedy. And many people were in the middle, in between those two, because you couldn't be on one side or the other of the two of them. They were literally the political bookends at that time, and Senator Inouye was one of them in the middle. But the ones we really depended on were at the ends, and they were the ones who helped us and helped the various federal agencies that did the very first repatriations, which were done under any sort of federal law, and that was done under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in 78 and 79 and 80. And those were pretty much in the Defense Department and with the Army, and there were a number of repatriations of not only human remains, but the precious things they had been buried with, and also cultural patrimony. And by cultural patrimony, what we meant was, as it's defined in NAGPRA, those things that were owned by the people as a whole, by the nation as a whole, or by a society as a whole, or by a clan as a whole, so that any one person couldn't alienate, couldn't make a deal and sell off this, because so many of the holding repositories told us that they had title to some of these items, to many of these items. Well, they had a piece of paper saying someone gave this to me or someone sold this to me, but oftentimes, or once in a while, not oftentimes, they had a bill of sale by a person who was of that group. And our point was, you can't depend on a person who's of the group because they're not acting for the group as a whole. So that's an important element of cultural patrimony. When we were dealing with these issues, the people who wanted to hold on to human remains and to things were saying it's our right, this is our property, because they had studied the people or the things we own these. So that was something that we worked very hard to readjust. And once we took it from property to human rights, which was the hardest struggle, most difficult thing that we did, from American Indian Religious Freedom Act through the follow-on legislation to that policy of repatriation, we insisted on the humanity of the people and the humanity of the next of kin, of the people who cared most about the people, about our dead relatives. We were very committed to that. In the national dialogue that Patricia talked about, we really insisted on a revamping, a legislating of the lexicon of respect. And that is something that people really fought us on, even in the report. And what I mean by that is the scientific terms were things like grave goods. So it wasn't scientific at all. It was just, that's the language of pirates. So instead of grave goods, we're saying funerary objects, and we're talking about the funerary process and burial grounds rather than the individual burials, talking about things that are part of the funerary process rather than what you do to get someone in the ground or in a cave. And we talked about surrogates, which is a very important part of this, that if something that has held a human being, their ashes, we're talking about cremation pots and other objects, these are the human remains. These are the same as the human remains. The surrogates are the same as the human remains. And I think a lot of museums are trying to fight that as if it's not already settled law, but that's settled law. We also, in the national dialogue, insisted on human remains rather than the scientific terms of specimen or bones or skeletons or other things that were non-specific and non-scientific. So in the National Dialogue report, the physical anthropologist and the archaeologist disassociated themselves from the term human remains by name in a footnote. And I was so happy that they had done that. Finally, they kind of came out in the open and said, oh yeah, we don't want anything that says human remains. You can say remains, but not human. And why? Because they didn't want international standards of human rights applied to our dead relatives. And what are those? That people get to be buried and stay buried. I mean, that's basically it. That people get to be disposed of the way they want and in the manner they want and in the way that the next of kin want. So those were our efforts and challenges, and it's always a little difficult to think about the things that were the most contentious at any given time, because you like to think that we've moved on and everyone's going in the same direction, but where you see some of these arguments cropping up again, as if these things have not already been resolved, then you have to take a look at it and not to say, how can we resolve it, but to say, here's a course correction for you. this is the course. It's already been settled. We've already worked on that. We've already decided it. Two of our earliest people who really supported repatriation were Charlie Rangel, whose district the Museum of the American Indian was in New York. And he and David Rockefeller, in the very first meeting of New Yorkers, meaning the people in New York who wanted a particular agenda for anything that might happen in negotiations for New York, that first meeting was co-chaired by David Rockefeller and Charlie Rangel, Representative Rangel, and they both said that they wanted a permanent presence for the museum in New York, no matter what happened, and they wanted repatriation for Native people. And they said, and Native people want this permanent presence in New York, and they want repatriation. And so people said, great, we're for it, even though they didn't understand necessarily what repatriation was. They understood what a deal was, and that's what we were making, were deals all along. I'm going to anticipate a question that was given that Phil Deloria may decide not to ask. So I'm going to answer a question that hasn't been asked, which is about Ross Perot's bid for the collection. Ross Perot really did us a great favor. It was at a time when we couldn't get commitments or the attention, in most cases, of people in Washington or in New York to saving this collection or to building a national Museum of the American Indian. And we were wed to both things, repatriation and a new entity in Washington was what we wanted. This is what we wanted, and this is what we ultimately got. But no one was interested in giving us that or helping us get there. So some of us were waiting around to go to, after a board meeting in New York, to go to dinner at Peter Crindler's place, which happened to be the 21 Club in New York. So we were at the highs and lows of New York society, and dealing with the water bugs and the wharf rats, and then going to the 21 Club. And the people were myself, Peter Crindler, Vine Deloria Jr., Charlie Charlie Simon, who was one of the partners of at Solomon Brothers. And he had been very silent during the whole board meeting when we were talking about who rejected us for what. And it was a pretty gloomy report. And Charlie said, well, what we really need is a bidding war. We need a bidding war where everyone wants this collection. And we said, well, that's a great idea, and good. How do you propose that we do it? And he said, well, I have an idea. Ross Perot wants a world-class museum in Dallas. And he's not particular about the class. And I think, that if we suggested to him that he could get this, he could help us get what we wanted by telling people he wants this. He might end up with it, but he would really be helping us reach our goal, which would be that he wouldn't end up with it. He said, I think he would do it. So we agreed that it was worth a call, and he made the call, and he came back to us and said he's going to do it. He's going to put out a public bid, and he'll do it with the New York Times. He's probably already done it. And we said, why is he doing this? And he said, he knows his place in American society. He knows who he is. And it was such an interesting exchange and evaluation of Ross Perot, and by golly, the minute it hit the streets that Ross Perot wanted this, there was an outcry from New York and from Washington saying, this is a New York treasure, how dare he? This is a national treasure. And everyone was just coming up with superlatives about what kind of treasure it was. And we have to save this, and Vine Deloria had the best line, which is, they're just terrified that he's going to get barbecue sauce on the beadwork. Well, and bless his heart, he did that for us. He did that for us and put himself out for public mockery, and was our best friend because he did start that bidding war that Charlie Simon so wisely knew we needed and foretold what would happen if we had it. So I want to wrap up my remarks just by saying that for the most part, I'm thrilled and delighted at the way that museums and other holding repositories, not the borough of Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, but most have implemented repatriation law and have done what we tried to do. And one reason that NAGPRA looks different from other laws, that you sort of walk along and then you fall off the edge and say, what happened there? It's because we built that into the law, saying we don't know enough here in this room to decide what happens out there. What we have to do is set up situations where the people who know most and care most about these people and things come together at the earliest possible time, and then they develop what they're going to do with repatriation. That the law is a continuing organic thing, that we're coming up with policy guidance, with policy guidelines, and we're not coming up with the ultimate solutions for anyone. So that we're making sure that Native people have a place at the table, that consent of the Native people is built in to this. What a novel idea, but it had not been before. And that human rights are regarded, that this is not a property issue, that this is a responsibility issue, and that we have these early interactions, and that the holding repositories need to figure out what they have and what kind of entity they are. Because what we were doing was part of the broader museum community, which was moving from storage to public interaction. That was the big movement that was taking place at the same time, and we benefited from that. And Secretary Bob Adams was right at the top of that and understood it, even though he was vilified from within the Smithsonian, and in some cases still is, because of what he did. But he was so right to be ahead of everyone else on this and to understand where that natural wave was going and why. So I really commend so many people here and in our recent past for doing so well in completing repatriations in the spirit that we meant them. That here's the framework, here are guidelines, here are strict requirements where needed, and now it's up to you. That's the part that's so interesting and so valuable, and the stuff of, I think, new scholarship that begins by saying, welcome home, welcome back.
Just have a couple of minutes left. Suzanne, one of the things that never fails to kind of amaze and frankly just blow me away whenever we have a conversation about some of these things is the extent of strategic thinking, of forward thinking, anticipating all kinds of contingencies, formulating plans, we sit and we look retrospectively back and things kind of maybe look a little better than they were. But not always, right? I mean, I think in this there was so much strategic and tactical thinking, that went into this over such a long period of time. And I wonder if you could step us back to, you mentioned 1967 as kind of this earlier moment. If you could step us back maybe to that first moment, and maybe just give us a quick picture of what some of those conversations looked like that ended up producing this strategy that over essentially a 50-year period of time has been actualized, here today.
Well, our various elders had told us to reserve time after ceremonies at Bear Butte, South Dakota, in June of 1967 for talks. And they wanted talks on what to do about people's dreams and visions where people were calling to them, or objects were summoning them, or they kept having views of things that were being held, like prisoners, in places. So we did that. We had 4 days of talks after these ceremonies, and there were a lot of elders, there were a lot of young people, especially young people who had just come back from Vietnam, from combat service in Vietnam, and who were particularly interested in bringing home people who had been killed there. And they were talking about human remains, and they were talking about them in very specific terms, Bob and Jim and Joe. They weren't talking about them in abstract terms. And they used these terms of prisoners of war, and so a lot of what we began to talk about was how you require the kind of ceremoniousness that the Army was using and that the Navy was using in the return of human remains and to the people, and that they weren't insisting on any particular ceremony, that they were respecting the things that were sacred and the ways that were sacred of the people, that they were returning the people and their precious things, whatever the precious thing might be, that it wasn't something that they kept. So this was very different from the way things had started out with the Smithsonian and the Army Medical Museum jointly advertising in the Rocky Mountain News and other newspapers for citizens to go out and bring them crania, Indian heads, and to bring them the grave goods. And they split them up between the Smithsonian Museum, as it was called then, and the Army Medical Museum. They just split them up, and it wasn't as simple as you get the people and you get the things. It was some of these, some of those, some of these, some of those. So, and they kept pretty good records, which is something that helped us in our efforts once we found them. I mean, everyone denied that these kinds of things went on. We had to find the evidence ourselves. And a lot of it was hidden in plain sight, and then once they were found, was just a treasure trove in the institutions of the Smithsonian Institution itself. So, like the reports of the Army officers who were going out, and one said, I waited until the cover of darkness, till the grieving family left the gravesite, and then exhumed the body and decapitated it, and the crania is transmitted forthwith. Now, just unpack that for a moment. He waited until the cover of darkness. He saw the people grieving and burying their loved one. I waited until cover of darkness, till the grieving family left. And then did this other thing. And this was an honorable enterprise for him. This was something that was meritorious, something that had been directed by the Army Surgeon General. My word. So we were doing something in 1967 that was so different from that kind of thing and that kind of thinking. And when we went out to build coalitions and to tell people, other people, what we had done, we found many people who were thinking along the same lines. At Zuni Pueblo, where we went first, and at other pueblos, and up and down in California, and in the Northwest, and then in the Northeast, there were people who had been working in different areas and thinking along these lines, and we just increased and increased and increased our knowledge base, our strategy base, we increased our thinking. By the time we got to the 80s, where we had really worked on something that would have been 12 dissertations in another setting. We knew what we were talking about. We knew what we had in common, even though we hadn't found the exact documentation about the Army Surgeon General stuff, their actions, and the Smithsonian's actions. We knew there had been beheadings, because every place we went to, people talked about beheadings. And no one had that in their traditions. No one had it. They had experienced that until the Europeans came, and everyone would ask the same thing. Why did they want our heads? Why did they take our heads? So our strategy was developed out of people's experience, people's history, the questions that people had, and what we saw as commonalities that had to be the truth, because they were experiences across cultural lines, across political lines, across tribal lines. They had to be truths that we were dealing with, and we had solutions here because someone had worked it out, or someone had thought about it enough to anticipate what would happen after we worked it out. So once, everyone knows a good idea when you hear it. Once someone had a good idea, we would all embrace that and move in that direction or move in another direction. So our strategy was really well-founded, well-based, well-sourced, and we understood what we wanted. We really understood what we wanted, so that once we got to the how do you actually do this part or this part, we already had answers. We already had a lot of answers. And if we didn't have answers, we knew that it was not appropriate for us to provide an answer, and that's where we had the leave it to the people approach. Leave it to the people who are going to implement this law. That's really the thinking and the process that we went through, and we did that from 67 to 89. We were still working on that, even though we had the framework for NAGPRA in our National Dialogue report in January of 89.
So this is a story that unfolds over a 150-year sweep, over a 22-year sweep, and over a 2-year sweep, right? Representing long-term political effort, strategic thinking, coalition building, linked up with a moment of possibility, people on the ground, changing social and cultural kinds of conditions within American society as a whole. And I think our two panelists have sort of taken us through both those kinds of scales. The quick turnaround in some ways that is the culmination of long-term kinds of efforts of people on the ground. It's 10:45, which means it's time for us to take a little bit of a break, stretch our legs. The restrooms are off of the lobby, drinking fountain near the entrance to the cafe. And if you would be so good as to, first of all, return at 11 when the symposium will resume. And second of all, to thank our two panelists, Patricia Zell and Suzan Shown Harjo.